All right, thank you guys for your patience and welcome to our evening's event. So great to see so many of you here. I want to thank a few people to help pull off this event. We want to thank the IS department and all the work that they did. And of course, our physical plant for moving these chairs and creating the space for us, and audiovisual equipment. I want to thank our administration for being such strong supporters of the Studies in Virtue and Human Value program and this speaker series in particular. And I want to thank also our assistant director, Ms. Sally Shelton, who does so much stuff behind the scenes. So thank you very much. I'm going to ask my colleague, Dan Straight, to come from Dr. Straight, to come and offer an opening invocation. And after he prays, Dr. Sidney Penner, one of our philosophy professors here, will introduce our guest speaker for the evening. Okay? Thank you.
With me. Dear Heavenly Father, we are so grateful to be here together tonight. You've called us to this place. Lord, we pray that your Spirit would fall afresh upon us. Our hearts and minds would be open, Lord. And we take just this moment in prayer, Lord, also to recognize that before we do anything, you have already loved us more unfathomably than we could ever comprehend. And so we thank you and praise your name above every other name. We thank you for our speaker tonight. We pray every blessing upon her, not only this evening, but on her work at the University of South Carolina. We pray, Lord, that she would be a child of the light. And we just thank you now for this time to be together. And we pray that your Spirit would be at work in helping us to become the people that you have called us to be and have created us to be. We thank you now, always, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Frey, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of South Carolina. Before joining that department, she was, for a year, the Collegiate Assistant Professor of Humanities at the University of Chicago, and before that got her PhD in philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh. A number of publications to her credit. She co-edited a volume entitled The Self-Transcendence and Virtue, has, I think, a couple of forthcoming books, and a whole series of articles in ethics, meta-ethics, and the philosophy of action, with a keen interest in how those subjects have been treated historically. As she put it, her thought has been especially influenced by the three A's. But it turns out there's a little bit of ambiguity with the three A's. When I think of the three A's, I think of Aristotle, Augustine, and Aquinas, but apparently she thinks of Aristotle, Aquinas, and Anscombe. So it's a more updated, more diverse list, I guess. In addition to her excellent professional writing, she actively contributes to public-facing philosophy, which I think we need more of, so that's something I heartily approve of. So she writes and gives talks and so forth, but in particular has a wonderful podcast entitled Sacred and Profane Love. So if you enjoyed tonight's talk, then you should go check out that podcast later on, in which she talks about literature and philosophical themes. Is that a good way of describing the podcast? All right, anyway, wonderful recommended podcast. Now, if all of that stuff weren't enough, I gather she is also the mother of 6 children and 6 chickens, and maybe occasionally does some gardening. So please join me in welcoming a master philosopher and juggler, Dr. Jennifer Frey.
I am sad to report that we only have 4 chickens now because someone forgot to close the coop door one night. Okay, so I'm super thrilled to be here, and I'm super thrilled with what I've learned of the honors program here, and I just think it's a wonderful thing that you have going here. So I'm going to talk about happiness, which is a thing that I do pretty often. The first part of my talk is just titled, What Ails Us? So insofar as we measure such matters, we can report confidently that Americans are not very happy. College students in particular report historically high rates of anxiety, depression, and loneliness. 30% of college students take psychotropic drugs to try to manage life. Suicide rates are at a historical high, up 33% in the last 15 years. Medical researchers are currently busy at work on a pill for loneliness, where loneliness is defined as a conscious feeling of estrangement or social separation, an emotional lack that concerns a person's place in the world. The Surgeon General has warned loneliness is a very serious public health concern. Now, suppose that you are among the lonely, the anxious, or the depressed. To whom do you turn for a diagnosis, or where would you look for a cure? Is your problem material, or is it social, or spiritual, or moral? How would you know? We certainly treat these disorders as if they are primarily material problems, and we turn to medical doctors to cure us. This medicalization of unhappiness has been noted by the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Marilynne Robinson. In an essay titled Facing Reality, Robinson wrote the following: I suggest that for us, the sense of sickness has replaced the sense of sin, to which it was always near allied, and that while we are acutely aware of the difficulties surrounding notions of good and evil, we ignore, although they are manifest, the equally great difficulties surrounding the notions of sickness and health, especially as these judgments are applied to human behavior. Antebellum doctors described an illness typical of enslaved people sold away from their families, which anyone can recognize as ordinary human rage and grief. But by medicalizing their condition, the culture was able to refuse the meaning of their suffering. I am afraid we are also forgetting that emotions signify, that they are much fuller of meaning than language, that they interpret the world to us and to other people. Perhaps the reality we have made for ourselves fills certain of us and our children with rage and grief. The tedium and meagerness of it, the meanness of it, the stain of fearfulness that it leaves everywhere. It may be necessary to offer ourselves palliatives, but it is drastically wrong to offer or to accept a palliative as if it were a cure. End of quote. So Robinson forcefully suggests that for many of us, our unhappiness is not merely material, but has spiritual and social etiologies, which our pills are not addressing. She worries that we have misdiagnosed our situation, that we have failed to grasp the meaning of our suffering, which makes us mistake palliatives for cures. Can great novelists diagnose what ails us? I believe they can if they're truly great. For instance, if you want to understand the cultural disease of the petite bourgeoisie in mid-19th century France, the experts to consult are not the historians of medicine, but Gustave Flaubert, the author of a novel called Madame Bovary. In Flaubert's novel, Emma Bovary dies because of her own desperate and unfulfilled longing for happiness, which she never finds, despite all her somewhat tragic comical efforts to attain it. Flaubert is quick to alert us to the fact that poor Emma was somewhat doomed from the start, for what her culture offered her as a candidate vision for the happy life, romantic fantasies over loving commitments and friendship, conspicuous consumption over the careful stewardship of goods, the pursuit of youthful beauty over wisdom. All of this was quite literally a dead end for Emma. Now, the great Southern writer Walker Percy explicitly argued that the novelist was a diagnostician. He wrote that the novelist is like a somewhat bemused psychiatrist. gazing at a patient who in one sense lives in the best of all possible worlds, and yet is suffering from a depression and an anxiety which he does not understand. That we live in a time of tremendous material comfort and technical progress, and yet everyone is miserable, bored, and filled with anxiety and angst, is probably the central underlying current of Walker Percy's fiction. But might the philosopher also be in a position to diagnose what ails us? This is the premise of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. Boethius, who lived between 477 and 524, he lived just on the cusp of what we now call the Middle Ages. So he was born just after the last Roman emperor was deposed and the first barbarian king was put into power in what we now call Italy. Boethius was a philosopher statesman, sort of in the model of Plato's Republic. He was from a noble, wealthy family. He was a senator by the ripe age of 25. And when he wasn't discharging the duties of his various political offices, he was busy translating Aristotle and writing philosophical and theological treatises. Now, eventually, Boethius gets caught up in the political intrigues of his day, and unfortunately, he comes out on the wrong side of the king, who orders his execution. Under house arrest, he writes what will become the single most influential text of the Middle Ages, and one of the greatest philosophical classics of the Western tradition. That's the Consolation of Philosophy. So the Consolation is a dialogue, and it's a dialogue that takes place between two characters. There's Boethius and there's Lady Philosophy. At the beginning, we find Boethius alone. He's imprisoned. He's very aggrieved. And when Lady Philosophy first appears to him in his cell where he's waiting to be executed, he bitterly complains to her that virtue has not brought him happiness, but ruin. He looks around and he sees that the wicked flourish like the bay tree. And of course, he's very upset about this, because if you've read your Plato and your Aristotle, then you know that the message is that virtue will make you happy. So he has a complaint. And Lady Philosophy, whose eyes burn brightly with the sort of vision that Boethius clearly lacks, comes to him not as a teacher, but as a physician. She promises to diagnose his sickness of mind and to heal and to cure him. After questioning him for some time, she tells him reassuringly that it's only a touch of amnesia that Boethius suffers. And his cure is to simply remember the philosophical wisdom he has so clearly forgotten. She berates him, "You have forgotten your true nature. It's because you are confused by your loss of memory. It's because you no longer know the end and purpose of things that you say these things about the wicked and the criminal having power and happiness." She says these are grave causes, and they lead you not only to illness, but even death, which is an interesting thing to say to someone who's awaiting their execution. Now, the rest of the book, which is Boethius's Cure and Consolation, is a treatise on the human person, what the human essentially is, and what human happiness consists in. It's interesting, of course, that it's a work of philosophy, right? It proceeds by careful argument, and it does not rely on Christian revelation. Now, what has always fascinated me about this text is the idea that philosophical wisdom can not only diagnose what ails us, but also to begin to help to see us towards a cure. Lady Philosophy does not save Boethius from his terrible fate or his unpleasant conditions. He's absolutely executed by Theodoric. Spoiler alert. But what she does do, and this is the thing that matters, is she helps to make sense of his suffering. I want to make a disquieting suggestion, and that is that in all the respects that matter, we're not that different from Boethius. Our problem is essentially the same as his was. We too have forgotten what we once knew about ourselves. We too don't really have self-knowledge. We don't know who or what we are or what our purpose is, if we have any. We don't know how to make sense of and contextualize our suffering, although we seem fated to suffering. And we are not at all sure what sort of life will truly satisfy us in a deep way. And part of the remedy, I think, but it's really only part, is to try to recover the knowledge of ourselves that we once had. And part of that recovery is, on the level of nature, on the level of philosophy, to think clearly about happiness again. So that's kind of the setup. I want to transition now to setting up a contrast between classical views of happiness and contemporary views of happiness. And by the classical view, I mean a view that was shared, broadly speaking, by pagan philosophers, by Christian philosophers, and Christian theologians. So the classical view of the human person looks something like this. Human beings are rational animals, okay? Christian tradition merely adds that it's because we are rational and free that we are made in the image of God. What does it mean to be rational and free? Well, it means that we have a kind of self-conscious, self-determined form of life, which means, among other things, that we don't merely see the world or things in the world, but we see the world in light of general concepts, which come to us mediated through a language, right? Which is a way of speaking and communicating with one another. So, for example, maybe I see a river, but I see more than an object of a particular color, shape, or size. I see more than movement. I see more than water. I see it as a river rather than a stream or a lake or an ocean. I might see it as something beautiful and powerful and useful for a variety of purposes, but also dangerous. It may be a place of memory for me. I may bring all sorts of imaginative ideas to it. I may find metaphor in it. It can be, for me, the stuff of art. This makes it different from the way that other animals would perceive a river. Most importantly of all, I am capable of wonder about this river. And this wonder can in me be the cause of a desire to have a deeper understanding of what I see. I can wonder as I look at it how it got there, how long it might remain. And this might eventually lead me to wonder about how everything got here. And finally, whether anything exists at all. So my vision of the river, my experience of the river differs from that of other animals who also see it, but do not see it as a river, and who cannot and do not wonder about it, or view it in relation to a conceptual and imaginative world whose possibilities seem infinite. So as a rational animal, I also have free choice, right? What I see guides my deliberation, and my deliberation guides my choices, right, about what to do in particular circumstances. And what I do, right, might lead to my flourishing, or it might lead to my ruin, or similarly, for the lives of other people. The way that I see things affects how I interact with them, right? A deep vision of life and the world, of what is valuable and what isn't, and why not, affects the way that I will live and the choices that I will make. And for this reason, right, I need to be attentive to whatever value is really there to be seen, to be in tune with the world and to see it as it actually is, rather than how I might want it to be. This includes, of course, also seeing other people for who they really are, rather than who I might want them to be. Now, to reflect specifically about happiness or living a good human life, we are asking ourselves, right, how we should aspire to live and what sort of human person we most wish to be. It's thought about the good, about what it would look like to embody human excellence in our own lives, in the own choices that we make. Now, Aristotle and Aquinas, along with St. Augustine, take it to be obvious that this sort of life will be demanding, that this is a feature of their view, not a bug. It's a view that allows for both heroism and mundane, everyday self-sacrifices. It allows that sacrifices can be beautiful and inspire awe and wonder, and that our suffering for the sake of what we take to be good is meaningful, precisely because it can work in us like a kind of purifying fire, right? Something that burns off all the flaws or the detritus that holds us back from attaining our own excellence. They don't find ordinary human suffering meaningless. Now, in its essence, the traditional conception of happiness is concerned with transcending the self, right? This kind of cramped space of protecting yourself. Now, if your only practical guide is a measure of self-interest, of protecting yourself, I think it's pretty clear from a classical perspective that you're never going to live a life worthy of imitation, right? Because you're never going to experience, or your life is never going to manifest the highest goods in human life. Because those goods do take self-sacrifice and suffering. And of course, they give interesting accounts of what they think those highest goods are. But among them are, for example, friendship and contemplation, and the sort of contemplation that you do with your friends. Now, all this is to say that the goal and the purpose of human life, of the moral life, is happiness. Greeks called it eudaimonia. Latins called it beatitudo or felicitas. But this is the measure of both our lives in general, as a whole, but also of our individual actions. And it was also part of this tradition that this is a natural end. That you desire to be happy is not chosen, but actually the condition for the possibility of choosing anything at all. It's what makes rational sense of your choices. Ultimately, the idea is that we seek what we understand to be good on the whole. We all want to possess what is really and truly good for us. So in this tradition, you cannot cease to want to be happy any more than you can cease to be a human being, okay? It's what you want. And the only question is, what do you think happiness consists in? What vision of the good life explains the choices that you make? Now, it's also a feature of the classical view, again, shared by pagans and Christians alike, that there's no hope, none at all, of living a happy life in absence of becoming a good person, a person with a certain kind of character. So virtue in ancient Greek, the word arte, it literally means excellence. And the virtues were understood as those excellent qualities of a person that enable them to possess the goods that make up for a happy human life. So you can think of an analogy. Like I said, it's a kind of natural goodness. So you can think about things that a young, immature oak needs in order to attain its full stage of flourishing, in order to reach its full potential as an oak tree, right? It needs water, and it needs sunshine, and it needs a certain kind of soil, and it needs to develop strong roots, right? Similarly, in the classical view, the virtues, right, are among those things that you need to cultivate, that you need to develop in order to reach your mature stage of flourishing. Now, again, stated at this level of generality, this is shared between pagans and Christians alike. And now I want to turn to St. Augustine. Maybe I should add him to maybe I should have 4 A's and add St. Augustine, because I do love St. Augustine. And in particular, I love the Confessions. And how many people have read the Confessions? Okay, excellent. Maybe next time I come, there'll be more hands. It's a great book. You should read it. So anyone who has read Augustine's Confessions knows that he believed from his own personal experience, and then eventually his, reasoned philosophical conviction, is that our most basic desire is for happiness, right? This is kind of the engine of our lives. Now, what's so interesting about St. Augustine is he's like so many ambitious, smart, and talented people. So he thinks he knows what he wants in life, and he also gets what he wants. So you'd think he would be happy. But it turns out that no matter how much success he experiences, no matter the honors he gains for himself or the pleasure that he attains in all the various departments of human life, at the end of the day, he feels anxious and empty. How is this possible, right? What Augustine realizes at a certain point is that he's never fully satisfied, and no amount of satisfying his ambition, no amount of achievement is helping him feel more satisfied. And he has this moment of clarity one day when he meets a beggar on the street. And he realizes, to his shock and his dismay, that the beggar is happier than he is. Because the beggar at least isn't worried about anything. Like, he's chilling out. And Augustine comes to see that nothing less than something like total fulfillment is going to satisfy him. But he also doesn't see anything in the way that he's living, right? Anything that he's actually striving after as something that's going to give him this, right? This is Augustine's restless heart. And of course, he announces on the first page, right, that his heart is going to remain restless until it rests in you, O Lord. But it takes him a long time to come around to really seeing this. Now, most students are, frankly, kind of floored the first time that they are presented with the classical view, and that was certainly the case for me. And I think one of the reasons why it's so jarring is that when we're taught morality in any context, we tend to think of morality in terms of following rules or following commandments, of meeting obligations, and we don't really think this has anything to do with our happiness, right? I think we tend to think that if, doing the right thing makes you happy and fulfilled, like, that's great, but a lot of times it might really just stink. But you have to do it anyway for some reason. This is like kind of a false choice from the classical perspective. So there's a kind of dualism in contemporary thought about practical reason, where it's a trade-off. Everything's kind of a trade-off between your pleasure and your morality, or your self-interest and morality. And so the question is, well, should I do what's going to make me happy, or should I do what's moral? And once you feel that you're faced with that choice between doing what's going to make you happy and doing what's going to make you moral, you're going to end up with the question that defines so much of modern moral philosophy. And that question is, why should I be moral, right? I know why I should be happy, but why should I be moral, especially if they don't non-accidentally align with one another? And so again, to me, this is a sign that we've kind of lost the plot in a way when it comes to thinking about happiness. The term itself has become somehow corrupted, or it's been made vulgar. And I think that's true. I think that nobody takes the pursuit of happiness very seriously. Even people who spend their lives theorizing and measuring happiness, right? Like, it's good, but nobody's going to pretend that it's the ultimate good or it's the point of your life. But again, from the classical perspective, it's the whole game. The whole game is to be happy. Now, how did this change come to be? Well, you have to understand that from a contemporary perspective, when people talk about happiness, this is true both in philosophy by and large, with a few notable exceptions. But it is certainly the prevailing view in the social sciences, and that is that happiness is a matter of subjective psychological states, okay? And you might construe them in different ways. Some theories of happiness are slightly more complicated than others. The most simplistic theory is just hedonism, right? So you're happy. If at the end of the day, we can say you had more pleasing psychological states than not pleasing psychological states, you just add them up and you have your answer. There are some more complicated views where you have to throw in a judgment about how you think your life is going on the whole. But notably, There's no third-person objective measure of whether or not your judgment is accurate. So whether you're happy is just a matter of whether or not you think you're happy, right? So if you are living under incredibly oppressive conditions and life looks really bad from you, but if on the self-report you say you're happy, that's what we go with, right? So it's just a kind of subjectivism. No matter what your theory is, it's a question of how you feel at the end of the day. And it's also just a question of what's up with you, right? How do you feel? And subjectivism, like I said, is the prevailing view. And I think it suffers from two very deep and related flaws that at the end of the day are fatal. One is it casts way too narrow a vision, right? So we're just looking at individuals and their psychological states. And two, it opens up a problematic dualism, or maybe even just a total divorce between the psychological perspective of the individual, just like how you feel, and how things are actually going for you. All we look at is how you feel. Now, I think these two problems shed light on one another. So in order to get you to feel kind of the force of the problem, since I'm a philosopher, I want you to engage in a kind of thought experiment. So I want you to imagine a virtual reality machine or some kind of virtual reality system that's so advanced that the line between reality and simulation is no longer clear to you, okay? So once you are in this simulated reality, you will seem to experience everything that you want. Just whatever you want, just plug it in. Love, security, professional success, pleasures of various kinds and degrees. And you don't suffer, right? So misfortune, illness, failure, oppression, it's no part of your experience, right? And this is like the important thing, once you're inside this simulation, you don't know that you're in a simulation, right? It all seems real to you. Now, the reality of what's going on with you is that you're just being manipulated. So whatever sci-fi vision you want to have in your head. But at the end of the day, you're just being manipulated to think that you are living a certain kind of life. But it's phenomenologically indistinguishable from a real life. And so the question is, would you choose to live your life in that simulation? Because it's going to be great. It's going to be great from a psychological perspective. Of course, it's not a real human life. So the question is, does it matter? Does it actually matter how you're living? Now, theories that understand happiness solely in terms of an individual's subjective condition, right? They have no way of telling you that you should not get into that simulation. In fact, a lot of subjectivists will just say, yeah, I mean, if you could really, generate such a machine, like you should get into it. Why would anyone choose to suffer? And I think it's interesting that people are willing to say this, because you have to understand that in this simulated world, your desires aren't really satisfied. Okay, you're not really in love. No one really loves you. You're not really you're not really living a human life. It just seems like you are, right? And so the question is the feeling enough? Or do you really want to experience real human goods? Is there a difference? Okay, here's another way to consider what might be wrong with subjectivism. So instead of thinking about individual choices, think about what sort of society you might build around a subjectivist vision of happiness. And this is not really so much a thought experiment, because people are doing this right now. People are building public policy based on data we have about what makes people happy. Now, the question about what sort of society we might build around a subjectivist theory of happiness is actually the theme of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. How many people have read Brave New World? It's so good. Everyone should read it. Okay, so it's a kind of sci-fi dystopia. So you have to imagine this dystopic future And one thing that's so interesting about Huxley's dystopia is everyone's healthy. There's like no disease, and also no one really ages anymore. So central to life and the society is psychotropic drugs, which are not treated as medicine. They're more treated like daily vitamins, okay? So you're supposed to take these psychotropic drugs every day, and it's a kind of preventative measure. It's to make sure that you never feel bad, right? So this pill is called Soma, and it brings about happiness. That's like what it's designed to do. And so any sign of feeling sad or anxious or upset or even just reflective, right? Even if you just step back to think a little bit about your life, the citizens of this brave new world are told to take this pill so that they're put back in the proper state of mind so that they can be happy, right? This is a society that is geared around happiness, after all. Now, for Huxley, it's really clear that this sort of happiness is basically deeply inhumane. It's at odds with our nature and our freedom and our rationality. It's clear that he thinks that it's bad. But it's very interesting. I mean, the best scene in the book is when one of the main characters sits down with the architect of such a world, and he gives his theory, like about why, this is the best society. But my point is that, again, if you are a subjectivist, a committed subjectivist about happiness, there is a question about why this isn't, in fact, the best society. Why would human freedom really matter in the end? Wouldn't it be better if you just felt good all the time? And that is the position of the architects of this society. From their point of view, they've done it. They've maximized happiness for everyone. At last, we have achieved true progress through scientific rationalism. So the question is whether or not, that's a world you want to live in. One thing that's very interesting about the Brave New World is that there's no love. There's a lot of sex, but there's no love in the Brave New World. There's only the satisfaction of bodily appetites, consumption of material goods, and cheap thrills. That's what the Brave New World offers. There are no marriages, no families, no friendships. There's no real intimacy besides physical. And there's no need for sacrifice or suffering, right? There's no deeper meaning or purpose beyond anyone's pleasure, which is the sum of one's world. And the question is whether or not you find that to be a sad and pathetic world, or whether it's a place that you would want to go to immediately. And I think in answering that question will tell you something about what you really think about happiness. So at any rate, I think the true problem that these kind of thought experiments isolate is that psychological subjectivism masks a kind of fundamental truth about human beings, which is that, we're rational and free, but also that we're social and political, right? And that means that our happiness isn't just a private good. It's not just an individual good. That our happiness is in some important sense a common good, right? So we don't flourish. We're not totally satisfied on our own, but somehow in communion, in community with other people, that we find our happiness, as it were, in some deep sense together. And this is something that, again, you find in the classical tradition, right? You have this idea that happiness it's a kind of common good. So what does that mean? I think you have to understand common in three senses. One, it's common to your nature as a human. Two, it's not competitive, right? So some goods are competitive, like the milk in the store. I get some milk in the store, there's less milk for you. I usually buy 3 jugs at a time because my kids drink an insane amount of milk. So now there's really less milk in the store for you. Happiness isn't like that. A lot of goods aren't like that. Wisdom's not like that. If I get some wisdom, there's plenty of wisdom left for you. I didn't take away from your wisdom at all. So it's not competitive. So my pursuit of it, my enjoyment of it, in no way detracts from yours. But this is, I think, the most important thing for this tradition, and that is that happiness is never solely the possession of an individual. And that's because it only comes about in in participatory, I guess you would say, or at least, yeah, the highest goods in human life, you might say, are participatory. So I'll just give an example. So you can think of an orchestra playing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Okay? You have a lot of parts. No one person can bring about Beethoven's Ninth, like no matter how good you are at playing the French horn part. And you might really enjoy playing the French horn part, especially if you're a really good French horn player, but you're not going to bring about Beethoven's Ninth just by playing your part. The symphony only comes about when all of the members of the symphony come together and they bring it about together. And they enjoy the symphony together, right? And it's somehow the idea is that it's more enjoying to play your part with everybody else, bringing about this common good. And in the classical tradition, happiness is like that, okay? It's not something that you just get on your own, let alone something that you can manipulate yourself into, whether by drugs or by machines or by some other means. And I think this gets to something important about the human good, right? We can recognize lots of things that are good in human life, like a good pizza, like that's good. And you can eat some pizza and you get some bodily pleasure, and that's good. And that just looks like, this is just a good that redounds to me. And that's because it's true. Bodily pleasure is like that. We can't really, my bodily pleasure is mine. I can't really share it with you, right? We can talk about it, but at the end of the day, it's my pleasure. But there are some human goods that aren't like that, like the good of friendship, right? Like the good of friendship, it can't be partitioned, right? In the same way that like bodily pleasure can. It is something that the friends enjoy in common together, right? When Aristotle talks about friendship, he talks about living one life together, right? That's what friendship is. You have shared activities that are oriented around a shared good. And in the highest form of friendship, the shared good is the happiness of the friends. That's like ultimately what you're going for, is the happiness that you get from being with your friend. And I think, again, if the model is just looking at individual psychological states, we lose our understanding of what sort of good friendship is, because it can't be reduced to something that I bear alone and you bear alone. It is something that we bring about and enjoy together. You sort of can't take it apart from the friendship itself. So friendship is one of those goods that involves a self-transcendent perspective in which each parts, right, of the relationship see their life and action in relation to a greater whole, right? Something that transcends the self, the friendship, right? That's the good. And I think, again, part of the classical view of happiness is that this kind of loving communion with other people, which takes a variety of forms, this is the stuff of truly happy lives. And again, it requires virtue. It requires good character, because in order to share our lives together in a way that contributes to our shared common good, we need to be the kind of person, right, who is capable of seeing the value in another person, of responding to that value, and reciprocating. And if you think about your friends, or you think about the people who you love, you're happy to make sacrifices for them, I hope, right? For example, I might have to sacrifice some important professional opportunity because my kid is sick. But if I love my kid, I'm going to do that without complaining, right? I'm not going to count the costs to myself. I'm going to focus on my child. And that's because I value that parent-child relationship more than I value my own private opportunities. So this is what Aquinas says when he talks about friendship. The part does indeed love the good of the whole, not, however, so as to refer the good of the whole to itself, but rather itself to the good of the whole. And that's exactly what's going on in friendship, right? You understand your individual good as bound up with another person. It's not just yours. It's not a private good. Now, in the specifically Christian tradition, you have the idea that the highest form of love and friendship is love of God and love of neighbor as oneself. That's charity, right? And if we go back to thinking about happiness as what's going to fully or completely satisfy us as human beings, in the Christian tradition, going back to St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, the answer is God, right? God is the only thing that's going to satisfy a rational creature. And that is ultimately where our true happiness lies, and all these other goods, the loving relationships that we have, are meant to ultimately be ordered to that highest good. And insofar as they are not, will themselves become disordered in various ways and sources of sin and suffering. But it's also part of this tradition that the loving relationships that we have in this life are a kind of foretaste of the eternal beatitude, right, that we can participate in with God. And again, so there you have a specific vision of happiness that has a kind of ultimate fulfillment or perfection that the pagan philosophers deny. They do not think you can be friends with God, and that in part has to do with how they think of God and in part how they think about human finitude. But you can see how on the classical view, no matter what you say, the ultimate end is it's going to be something that you should order your life around, that will require the cultivation of virtue, that will be demanding of you, right? You'll have to suffer and sacrifice for it. But at the end of the day, it's what's going to ultimately fulfill you or satisfy you or complete you. So here you have a picture where morality and happiness are part of the same package, right? The reason to be moral, the reason to cultivate virtue is because it's that which enables you to be completely and fully satisfied. Okay, so really briefly, I want to turn to this question of diagnosis. That's how I started. So on the classical view, virtue is aligned with health of the soul, and vice is described as a kind of illness. Aquinas calls it a kind of addiction, actually. And I think that part of what ails us today is that we have no conceptual space for thinking about healthy souls anymore. We have a conception of mental health, but it ignores the more spiritual dimensions of human existence because it only recognizes what is material. And this is a narrowed vision, and I think it's blind, right, to various, the spiritual depths, I guess, of human life. And again, this reductive materialism leads to dualism, and it's a dualism that is right at the heart of subjectivism. The subjectivist is a dualist. He has to be. He tears apart what is good for an individual and what is objectively good. He denies that virtue could be a bridge between what is good for an individual and what is truly good without qualification for all human persons. But I think we should take more seriously the thought that the cultivation of virtue is a deep transformation of the human person and human psychology, that it's a refining of human nature into a certain shape that we would call human excellence. This shaping takes work, but it is the task of becoming truly free and of being able to see the world as it truly is and responding in kind. Virtue does make us fit to enjoy the fruits of our own flourishing. It does take suffering and sacrifice to acquire and exercise. And ultimately, I think it takes divine grace for us to do this without counting the cost to ourselves, right? But at the end of the day, we have a vision in which an individual person is subjectively fulfilled or satisfied in the deepest possible sense when she is conformed to the reality of what is objectively good for her, and when she has become able to see it. On this view, there is no dualism between morality and happiness. Such divisions make no sense in this tradition. Rather, they insist that the goal of the moral life is happiness, and that there could be no other goal worthy of your fullest measure of devotion. Thank you for your attention. And hopefully we have time for questions. Or did I talk for too long? I wasn't really sure. We're good. There are no bad questions. I'm firmly committed to this. Does that mean that everyone agrees? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Whether it's locally or at the state level or national or international level, that our happiness decreases depending upon the social situation.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
But perhaps not enough to come holding roots to move us away from this deeply entrenched. If I'm happy, it has to be about me and mine. Instead of recognizing what you're talking about is the whole is part of our ongoing happiness, which is both a happiness and a good.
Yeah.
Just talk more about how, after all that we've heard, how can we get ourselves to this understanding of where it becomes pragmatic, that we really understand my happiness is intertwined with others.
Yeah, I mean, I think, on the one hand, it's like we have a lot of data on this. So, like I mentioned that, they're working on a pill for loneliness. And that's because loneliness kills people. It really does. And I think that the explanation of that, again, goes back to the kind of thing that we are. We're not the kind of thing that comes to be what we are on our own. I mean, you only come to be a mature, linguistic, reasoning animal with a lot of help, like an insane amount of help, actually. And even then, you still might not be very good at it. But so I think that the thing about human beings that we tend to forget or not be able to fully explain is the fact that, we're simultaneously things with interior freedom and, an interior life, but that interior life is profoundly shaped by our social circumstances. And I think sometimes we focus too much on one or the other, right? So, sociology has nothing to say about the inner life, but it can tell you a lot about social circumstances. And that's great, but we have an interior life, right? So something goes totally missing from the merely sociological perspective. Now, You can read, the spiritual masters and learn a lot about the interior life. But the truth is your interior life is profoundly shaped by your social circumstances. And so we really need to come to have a more synoptic or a holistic perspective on the human person. And this is something that I have written about. But, I think our universities, which I obviously love and make my life in them, but, we really compartmentalize and we specialize. And so we narrow in on one aspect that I think, we can really lose sight of the whole. I think this ends up being problematic in a variety of ways. So I think that I don't have any simple solutions. I'm really good at diagnosing problems. This is like, the thing about the philosopher is that they're really good at locating a problem, but they're not so good at solving it. But especially if the problem is practical, because we really have no idea. But I think that it's just good to, it's good to try to have self-knowledge, right? And not lose sight of the fact that what's really going to make you happy, one, isn't what the culture is telling you is going to make you happy, but two, really depends on how you relate to your social environment. And some of that you can't fix, right? But some of it you can. And I just really think that, especially for young people now, and I say this as the mother of two teenagers, you really need to get off your phones and actually interact with other people, because all this online stuff that you're doing, one, is making you miserable and anxious, and we know this, the data is overwhelming, but two, it's not real human interaction, okay? It's totally flattened out and mediated, and it creates all kinds of, and it's making you miserable also. So find those ways to be fully present to another person that likes you. Just start there. Be fully present. And you're not fully present on your phone. You're just not. No emoji makes up for actual human responses. And so much stress and anxiety just comes from the fact that people can't, all affect is taken out of a text. So you look at a text and you're like, they're mad at me. And then you worry about that for a half an hour. They're not mad at you, right? They were texting you while they were driving or something. You have no idea. So, I think some of this is really basic, right? Be fully present to another person. Give them your time and your attention. So much of your life and the moral life is what you're paying attention to. And I think that if you all took some time to reflect on where your attention is going, you would see that it's being drained by stuff that doesn't really deserve it and isn't making you happy. It's true for me too. So it's not but that's something that you can diagnose and find ways to solve, right? You can't, create the political utopia on your own. There are lots of things you can't fix. But these little things, these everyday things, are actually very important. The things that are right in front of your nose, but you're not necessarily paying attention to, are really important, and you can do something about them. And, we all should. Yes.
So I'm pretty confident that you're familiar with Aristotle's view of habituation.
Yes.
And you kind of touched on this lightly. I believe you implied something along the fact that it's hard to be virtuous and find happiness without a community.
Mm-hmm.
And Aristotle just mentioned that it's nice to have a teacher to guide you as you learn. Because it's not natural for anyone to happen. So what I would ask is it possible to find virtue by yourself, or would you have to have a community?
I think it's impossible to become fully human by yourself. I mean, imagine if first of all, quite frankly, if we took you from your mother the moment you were born and set you down, you'd be dead within a day? I mean, you're done for, right? So you need somebody to feed. You can't feed yourself. It's amazing. Like, look at a horse. There are lots of horses. Horses come out and they run. And you're like, wow, we come out, we can't even roll. We're just literally, it's amazing. You will know this when you become a parent. The human infant is, for a variety of interesting reasons, utterly dependent on someone being very invested in it remaining alive. And quite frankly, the same is true of toddlers. If you spend any amount of time on toddlers, you know that the death drive is very strong in them. And it's like, why are you running in front of a car? Do you not have instincts? What's happening? So there's that, right? But then on top of that, how are you going to learn a language? You cannot learn a language on your own. That's not spontaneously going to arise in you, and we know this. And if you don't have a language, right, you're not going to bring things under concept. You're not going to practically deliberate, and you're not going to have free choices. You would be living a kind of animal life. That you would have that potential, but it's just never been realized in you. So, when Aristotle says man is a political animal, he really means it, right? He means if you're not born into some kind of basic political unit, right, there's no chance for you, right? There's no chance. And in terms of habituation being natural, Aristotle says it's like second nature, right? So habituation into human practices, human language, virtue, or vice, depending on how you're habituated, is being brought into a culture, and that is a human thing. It belongs to the human to have a society and a culture, right? Now, the culture might be good or bad, but it belongs to the human to have that. And so virtue is second nature. And by that, he means that you're not just going to develop it on your own. You're going to see. Unless something's wrong with your visual system, you're going to see the world, right? But you're not going to see the world in that complicated way that I described unless you are initiated into a culture and a community and you can deploy concepts, right? And make judgments and make free choices. All of that is what Aristotle calls second nature. It requires other people habituating you into this. You can't get that on your own. So that's what Aristotle means by man as a political animal. He is only going to flourish in society with other people. And so the question for him is, what's the best kind of society? What's the best sort of arrangement? What are the best laws, right? Those are going to be the laws that don't maximize, what we call freedom now, which is freedom from coercion. That's not freedom for Aristotle. For Aristotle, true freedom and good laws are, those norms that make human flourishing possible. And that's going to be a political reality for him.